And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing a next system here pushing some rain across the Bering Sea, pushing it toward the Pribilofs later tonight, and rain across the Aleutians spreading into Nikolsky toward morning, and staying dry with light winds not only along the west coast here but across all of the interior from the Arctic coast down into the Gulf of Alaska. This system continues to slowly move eastward there across Dixon Entrance and continues to weaken. That'll keep rain going, light rain going over the southern southeast coast. Winds really coming down tonight there with that, and light winds, maybe some showers here up to the north. And this system just grazing Kodiak Island as it exits the Alaska Peninsula. And then for tomorrow, that pushes eastward here into the southwestern Gulf of Alaska. And some moisture lifts northward and brings increasing chances for precipitation from western Prince William Sound eastward all the way down into the central southeast coast, a little bit drier down toward the southern areas. Light winds, partly to mostly sunny skies across much of the mainland areas, and cloudy along the coast here with increasing chances of rain along the Yukon Delta coast, with some rain pushing into St. Lawrence Island down to Nunivak Island. A wet foggy day for the Pribilofs, and that'll extend down to the Alaska Peninsula as well. Light precipitation associated with this weak frontal boundary here. Then a stronger system out to the west we'll see on Thursday becomes quite a storm as it moves into the central Bering Sea. The pressure down to 958 millibars. So there'll be gale force winds, storm force winds, and hurricane force winds here. It looks like the strongest winds would be back here in the western southwest quadrant of that storm, but still some pretty good winds come into the southwest coast here, with rain pushing at least up to the Kuskokwim Mountains by late in the day, extending down across Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula. And a high wind warning kicks into effect for the entire Aleutian chain Thursday afternoon, continuing through Thursday night and into Friday for strong winds. And then rain, light rain, here over the southeast coast, and stays fair over the areas north of the Alaska Range of the Arctic coast. Look for more cloudiness and some scattered showers here for the mainly along the western Alaska Range, and some shower activity for the North Gulf Coast and Prince William Sound. And for the coastal water forecast here for the south coast of the Panhandle tomorrow, northwest winds at 20 knots, west-southwest winds 15 to 20 knots here for the central coast, and the north coast east to southeast at 15 knots. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, north winds 10 knots, northwest at 20, seas 11 feet for Clarence Strait. And then for Thursday, Clarence Strait, southeast winds 20 knots, seas 5 feet, and southeast winds here for the central and northern inner channels, and southeast 25 to 30 knots there for the south coast of the Panhandle, seas 8 to 9 feet. East winds 20 to 25 knots for the central coast, and east winds 25 to 30 knots for the north coast, with 9 to 12 foot seas up there. And for Cook Inlet tomorrow, light variable winds at 10 knots with seas 2 feet or so. West winds 15 knots, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. Northwest at 15 for the western North Gulf Coast. And for the eastern North Gulf Coast, variable winds 10 to 15 knots. Prince William Sound east at 15 knots. And then we'll see an increase in the winds on Thursday here. East at 30 knots there for the eastern North Gulf Coast area, seas up to 8 feet. And east at 20 for Prince William Sound with seas around 4 feet. Northeast 20 knots here south of the Kenai Peninsula. And the Barren Islands looking at east winds at 20 knots, northeast at 20 for Kamishak Bay. And Cook Inlet, northeast winds 10 to 15 knots, seas 3 to 4 feet. Alaska Peninsula, variable winds 10 to 15 knots for the day tomorrow. Light east winds at 10 knots for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, variable winds at 10 knots with seas 2 to 6 feet. And then for the outlook on Thursday, south to southeast winds 30 to 35 knots for the Alaska Peninsula with seas 6 to 11 feet. Gale warnings developing there for Bristol Bay, right out of the east at 35 knots, and Kodiak Island northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians for tomorrow, we're looking at west-southwest winds 20 to 25 knots with 5 to 7 foot seas. Central Aleutians west at 25, and for the Amchitka Island, west winds 25 knots, And then out to the west there, they become more south and southwest at about 20 to 30 knots. And then for the day on Thursday, storm warnings for the entire Aleutian chain out. Looks like about 50 to 55 knots here for the eastern Aleutians and 50 to 60 knots there for the central and western Aleutians. And then for the southwest coast tomorrow, we've got east-southeast winds 15 to 20 knots, southwest at 10, pretty light for Norton Sound, southeast 15 for St. Lawrence Island, and south winds at 20 knots for St. Matthew Island, south at about 15 for the Pribilof Islands. Let's see what Thursday holds with that big storm coming into the Bering. Gale warnings, south 40 knots for the Pribilofs, east 40 knots for St. Matthew Island, seas a little over 15 feet in both those areas. Gale warnings here for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, southeast winds 40 knots, seas 9 feet. Small craft advisories for the Yukon Delta coast, southeast at 25 knots. Southeast winds 20 knots for the St. Lawrence Island area. Norton Sound, southeast at 25. And for the far eastern Arctic coast here, Kaktovik over to Demarcation Point, Barter Island, in those areas, southeast at 25 knots tomorrow. Otherwise, light winds here for the central and eastern areas, 5 to 10 knots, east at 10 on the western Arctic coast, and the Chukchi Sea anywhere from southeast to northeast at about 10 knots. And for the day Thursday, the Chukchi Sea looking at east to south winds at 20 knots, western and central and eastern Arctic coast, southwest winds roughly around 10 knots with seas running 2 to 3 feet.